We're joined by Alisa Solomon and Mark Harris. Let's start off with you, Alisa. Is there something in the film that we may not have seen, or we don't realize, or we've missed in a way, that we should be taking away from the film that isn't apparent? Is there something about it? It's a complex film in many ways. Do you have any thoughts about something in the film that isn't so apparent, some idea that we should take? And I'll let you sit with that. There may not be a great answer to that, but it strikes me that because it is such a politically charged issue, that there are things that people misread about the film, that there's a perspective about the film that could be misunderstood. And then in the typical way that Hollywood films tend to both manipulate and distort truths, is there something here in the way this story, I mean, this is an AIDS film, and it became, because it was, I think, an Oscar-winning film for Tom Hanks. It was, I hate to say this because my students know how much I despise Schindler's List, but it's the Schindler's List as an AIDS film. Mm-hmm. And so I can speak about things about Schindler's List that I despise about the film. And I'm wondering whether there's something about Philadelphia that we might have similar thoughts. But we'll hold out for a second. Mark, your really great book about the 70s, Pictures of the Revolution, this is a film of the 90s. Do you have a view of this film as how it sits as part of it's for many people an iconic film? In your mind, is it one?
You know, I think that 15 years old is an awkward age for people and for movies. And I was, you know, it's not old enough to be vintage yet, but it's no longer new. Mm-hmm. And this was a movie I want to point out that, although it was iconic, was also seen in 1993 as deeply problematic for the progressive community, the gay community, the political community. Many people complained that it was schematic and overdrawn in some ways, and in some ways it is. Many people complained bitterly that it was not really an AIDS movie. It was not the story of a gay man. It was the story of a straight homophobe's journey to understanding through his experience with a gay man, and in many ways they were correct.
But I just want to say that is typically Hollywood.
That's typically Hollywood, but having said that, I also want to say that from my point of view, I think that we may have been too hard on it in 1993. I think that there are actually some considerable virtues in telling the story of a straight homophobe and his journey to understanding. And, you know, what struck me when I was watching the movie was the number of actors in it who were HIV positive, who had AIDS at the time, who died of AIDS just a year or two or three in some cases after the movie was made. To see this movie today is to realize that for all the global horror of the AIDS epidemic today, we are living in a staggeringly different world here in the United States than we were 15 years ago. You know, a lot of gay people were very angry that this movie didn't go far enough, that it was too homogenized, that it was too Hollywood, that we played the typical game of having Tom Hanks, the most likable actor in the universe, play, you know, a gay saint. But one of the problems with a group being underrepresented, as gay people have long been in movies, is that the group that's underrepresented always tends to ask too much of the representations that we finally get. I think that some of us were upset that this movie was not the gay movie, the AIDS movie. It turns out to be an AIDS movie, a gay movie in some ways, not a gay movie in others. For me, the big surprise tonight was that although it is a period piece in that it is very much of its historical moment, it holds up very well in some ways as a representation of certain aspects of that moment.
Mm-hmm. Alisa?
Well, I have to agree with Mark that it seems better now than it did 15 years ago. I mean, I guess like, you know, just like people, you look back on adolescent people when they're adults, and they somehow seem charming in retrospect, when at the time they were insufferable, or we were insufferable. And,
Was the film insufferable to you 15 years ago?
Yes, the film was insufferable to me 15 years ago, and for some of the reasons Mark was just describing that I'll come to, and in certain ways I still feel the aversion to the melodramatic manipulation of it, and so on. And some of those, to go back to your original question, I think one of the things that we demanded of it at the time that I think is still a legitimate question is, well, why didn't Andy call the ACLU or Lambda Legal Defense? I mean, why did he go to 10 lawyers and end up with a, cash accident lawyer? Obviously, because that's the plot that drives the movie. But it was completely unrealistic. There were organizations and activist groups and legal groups and all kinds of institutions in place for exactly this kind of situation. And one of the problems we had with the film was it characterized a gay man and man with AIDS as an individual fighting the world in his heroic way by himself, as if he is absent of any kind of political community. Yes, you see he has friends, he has a party and so on, but there's no political or movement infrastructure around him. And in fact,
the only movement
there
you see is on the other side. You
That's right,
see a
outside the
brief
courtroom.
anti-AIDS protest, but that's the only organized.
And then, about the point of it being the journey of a homophobe, it's absolutely true, and it is all Hollywood. I mean, if you remember the Steve Biko movie, it wasn't a movie about Steve Biko. It was a movie about Donald Woods, who came to understand that apartheid was bad and to fight for it. And those kinds of movies are always about the straight white guy.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
And it's a problem. What's most interesting about this is that the figure with whom we have to identify, or the character who is the stand-in for us, the presumed audience, is an African-American man. And Mark, you probably have some things to say about how this is the kind of queer who's coming to dinner kind of movie, and the change that Hollywood had undergone in the 20 years until this movie was made.
I mean, I was struck by that, by Alisa's point in particular. Yes, Tom Hanks is the Sidney Poitier movie the Sidney Poitier figure in this movie for audiences of the time. If you had to have a gay son, who wouldn't want to have Tom Hanks, the sweetest actor in the universe, as a gay son? But, in watching it now, I'm struck by, for all of the praise that Tom Hanks got and for all of the courage that is routinely imputed to any straight actor who plays a gay role, the brave one in this case was Denzel Washington, because, lest we criticize this movie too harshly, I can count on the fingers of one fingerless hand the number of movies since Philadelphia to even brush by the issue of homophobia among African Americans, something that is still too difficult and painful a topic for movies to touch. And this movie, without ever being explicit about it, just makes the African American the figure of identification for a white audience. It's actually, or a presumed white audience. It's a somewhat subversive thing to do. It's very much in line with Jonathan Demme's other work, where he tends to play with things like that very interestingly, right up to and including in Rachel Getting Married, his newest movie. When I watched the movie in 1993, the stuff that Alisa is talking about, its out-of-dateness in terms of its inability to acknowledge a gay political movement, an infrastructure, a support system, really rankled. The fact that this was a movie full of 1988 thinking about AIDS, released in 1993, made it feel hugely out of date. From a distance of 15 years, the things about it that were so infuriating, and I will say legitimately infuriating, are a little bit overshadowed for me this time by the things about it that are effective. From a movie perspective, this was a very big hit. Just to put it in numerical terms, it made more money in real dollars, not just adjusted for inflation, than Brokeback Mountain did more than 10 years later. This was a real breakout, the first gay drama to reach a wide audience. And, Alisa pointed me toward this piece by Larry Kramer which you can talk about more.
I can't because I couldn't put my hands on it.
Oh, okay. Well,
Did you find
yeah,
it?
I found it on the
No.
internet, and Larry Kramer, no one more outspoken, assuming that anyone could actually ever outspeak him, hated the movie. And one of the things he said about it was a bigot could see this movie and come away from it completely unchanged and undisturbed. And I think in some ways he's right, but the two things that struck me watching this are that it's not the job of art to change the mind of bigots. It's not the job of a movie to be a sledgehammer on the forebrain of the dullest mind, the most closed mind in the world. Other things can be used to work on bigots. And the second thing is, I'm not sure he's right that this had no impact. I think that to cast two of the most successful and likable actors in Hollywood in the lead parts, I think there's no question that Tom Hanks' performance and his Oscar speech moved the needle a little bit for some people in Middle America. It made AIDS more relatable and less alien, and you don't have to say that those people were out and out bigots beforehand and converts afterward. Sometimes moving the needle is a very big accomplishment for a movie.
I was struck by what you said about homophobia in the African American community, and I noticed for the first time in watching this film the line that Andrew Beckett's mother says early on when she says, "We didn't raise a son to sit in the back of the bus." And I thought, oh, well, there's an interesting alignment. And was there on some level an alignment between racial discrimination? It's that in fact it's not an accident that we have Denzel Washington as the plaintiff's attorney.
Except supposedly it is. I mean, that's part of the mythology of the film. I don't know how true it is. I mean, it's an interesting line for two reasons.
It's
I mean,
bizarre.
for many, but
Yeah.
for one is the story is. I mean, you might know if it's actually different. The story is that that the part was written as an Italian American lawyer,
right.
and that Denzel Washington was around somebody who was reading the script, and he got interested, and he called Demi and asked for the part, and that they decided not to adjust it in any major ways, and that the line about the back of the bus
Would have existed anyway.
And the other point about it is it's largely because of that line that a lawsuit was brought against the filmmakers by a family whose son had died of AIDS and he had been fired from a job. I don't know if it was a law job. And he had been one of the sources for the film and apparently had been promised some money. And supposedly his mother, it was a white family, his white mother had said the line, "I didn't raise my son to sit in the back of the bus."
So in fact,
and
it
so
was
that
an
line
accident.
that line went into the film, and that was one of the lines that was then used to win the family a settlement.
But legally speaking, and thankfully you're both not lawyers, maybe the idea, and by the way, please don't even, Mark knows this about me, most of the room are not lawyers, by the way. We only cater to civilians. But there does seem to be sort of an interesting parallel, as if to say that there is a connection. The next wave of justice moves from civil rights to sexual discrimination,
Well, it happens
sexual
most-
orientation.
Most blatantly in the law library scene, right, where they exchange reading the paragraphs aloud about discrimination on the basis of disability and the recognition of AIDS as such, and the camera, has that overhead shot of the two of them across from the table. I think that's where the parallel is.
Right, and you would not have
established.
had that with an Italian.
And
By the way, it wasn't Sylvester Stallone they were thinking about. Somehow that just doesn't look right to me. But anyway.
I think the movie does very well, though, for not making that explicit, for Ron Nicewander, who wrote the script and who I think was the only major gay artist involved in the making of the movie, out gay artist. To draw some explicit connection about an issue that still through this presidential campaign has been argued out and continues to be argued out in churches among senior members of the African American civil rights movement and the gay civil rights movement generationally. I mean, this is such a long way from being resolved. In 1993, to attempt to make a statement about that would have absolutely been to bite off more than this movie
Right.
could have chewed.
Well, speaking about biting off more than it can chew, let's just speculate for a moment. And I wonder whether this is Larry Kramer's point, because I did not read the piece. Andrew Beckett is a dutiful son. He's a Penn law graduate. He's a just nice guy. I mean, aside from the fact that he's been portrayed by Tom Hanks in the film, right? The character is a good son, a good partner, a good lawyer. He's smart. He likes opera. What if he was a promiscuous cruiser? Would we have any sympathy? We should have. It should be the same. It should be the same. And yet, if we had had him, you know, a biker or someone with lots of tattoos, we would have had a very, very different. Could we have watched it?
Who's we? We in 2008. We in 1993.
Well,
we in Manhattan. We in Iowa.
But I think even if he's still a shiny, nice white guy who's a good lawyer, but he went to that movie theater not 3 times and had anonymous sex once, but he went every weekend, but he's still the same guy.
Well, that was the one
I think
attempt
that's-
they had. They took one shot at that, right? They cheated. They took one shot. Have you ever been to the Stallion? They had to take one shot. Now, I don't know if that's enough of a shot at saying, well, let's portray Andy in some terribly unsympathetic way, risky, that this is brought upon by himself, that he is too adventurous, and that therefore he's not the guy you think he is.
Although I think the movie pointedly makes it clear that to draw a distinction between quote-unquote innocent victims and people who brought it on themselves is a grave moral wrong.
But it's not about bringing it about himself. He's just not as likable if we think he goes to the Stallion every night.
Well,
He should be the same.
You
If
know,
we're not discriminating, he should be the same. Why would we care? And yet, it's not just that, and it was that slipping moment where she says, concealing and dishonest. And then Denzel Washington says, I object, Your Honor, because it's dishonest that we're objecting to, right? It's supposed to be, so now it's like, okay, forget. It's not that he lies to Miguel. It's simply that he's not the guy you think he is. He's the guy we fear instead of the guy that we would, the guy instead of we love that we would ordinarily loathe.
except that you don't, I mean, in 1993, how someone got AIDS was certainly more on the minds of audiences than it would be now.
Right.
You see the movie, because AIDS and its effects were more visually apparent in 1993 than they would necessarily be today, you surmise that Antonio Banderas' character is HIV negative. It would have been a question in the minds of a lot of people who saw the movie back then, well, how did he get it? I don't think that the purpose of including that information in the movie is to undercut sympathy for him. I think it's to test sympathy for him. I think it comes late in the movie. They have brought you this far with Tom Hanks. You're totally on his side. And then the movie asks you to incorporate this piece of information about him into your understanding of him as a human being. So in a way, that information is a challenge to the audience that this movie was intended for.
And makes it, I agree with that, and I think makes it a little bit easy because there's nothing about Andy that's been at all sexual, all
Right.
through the film. I mean,
There's a hug during a dance, that, and many, many people complained that there wasn't even a kiss in this movie, which is still striking today.
and the other thing I think we need to comment on is the perfect family that he has, and I think that 15 years ago there was also a lot of just incredulity that,
He could be that well embraced
yeah,
by everybody.
by everybody.
Although, you know, through the 80s and 90s, middle-aged actresses did a land office business in playing the
That's
mothers
true.
of sons with AIDS. I mean, it was
Okay,
like the
the
great
mothers,
gig.
but the
you
brothers
know.
and the fathers?
Yeah, no, it was Norman Rockwell plus a gay kid. But you know, I think that was also a little bit of wish fulfillment thrown to gay viewers who you know, many of whom would have loved to have had
Yeah.
families like that.
Well, that's totally how I responded to it now,
You know, in
I
the,
admit.
Right.
the second night of our film festival, for them, so that you were here, we saw Lenny. And I was struck by, there's always something when you watch all the movies together after 6 nights, you realize, oh, there's these connections. For those of you here on Saturday night, that was that great moment when Lenny Bruce unloads every single sexual, racial epithet known to man, right? He just uncorks everyone, and everyone is really disturbed, unbelievably uncomfortable. And then he basically admits, well, this is what we're thinking, and these words are actually innocuous and innocent. You just need to hear it. And of course, Denzel Washington uncorks the same thing. Does it diffuse? Does it demystify? Does it work?
As a non-lawyer, I was somewhat mystified that it was happening. Maybe the lawyers.
It was an incredibly strange scene where he says, tell us what you're doing, and then he turns around and talks to everybody but the judge.
I think honestly it would have had more impact if we hadn't already heard him use the word faggot at home with his wife, in the drugstore with the guy who hits on him. Like, by that point I sort of felt like, I get it. But it's, you know, watching it now, it really struck me that when movies come out, at the moment they come out, we often tend to punish them for what they're not, for how far they didn't go, for what they should have been. If the fundamentals of the movie are sound, if their heart and their mind are basically in the right place, a lot of the flaws become forgivable over the years. If their head is really in the wrong place, the movie becomes even more intolerable over time.
Well, do you think, sort of along those lines, that this wasn't to some extent, Jonathan Demme's penance for Silence of the Lambs?
Does anyone know why Alisa says that?
A lot of people did suggest this, that Silence of the Lambs, which Jonathan Demme had made, I think, 2 years before this movie, had a gay serial killer, sort of gay / transvestite / femi serial killer.
/ very creepy,
Right.
gay.
Like,
There's like,
even
say
by
creepy,
the standards of serial killers,
Right.
very creepy.
but he happened to have been gay and a
He had
transvestite.
he had a
right?
pit.
Right, in a pit.
And as a huge Silence of the Lambs fan, I didn't have a problem with this as a gay viewer. A lot of people really did. Jonathan Demme has always said no. This wasn't an act of atonement. He didn't feel that he had anything to atone for. But it was certainly taken that way by many people. I mean, this was, you know, you mentioned Schindler's List. This came out the same year as Schindler's List. I think the same month as Schindler's
No, I
List.
think it's dead on the money. And I'm sorry, what were you going to say? Because I have something about Schindler's List as well on this.
Well, you know, it struck me. I don't feel the same way about Schindler's List as you do, but they certainly share something in common, which is that they ask you to experience the travails of a minority through the intervention of a benevolent person from the majority.
Right.
And as a dramatic strategy, that has its limits, and it's also extremely effective in some ways.
Although you pointed out that it's an African American, and he's not really the majority, except that he doesn't have AIDS. He himself,
Alisa said that, yeah,
is a minority, so it's not like Oscar Schindler. He's not really part of the majority. You're watching it through the perspective of someone who himself is a minority, which is, again, this sort of curious and interesting connection between those people who have suffered racial discrimination and those people have suffered sexual discrimination. I have another really great movie connection that you will love because you will just love this. Right? Denzel Washington was part of an earlier film. I don't know who directed it, but it was the Matthew Broderick film called Glory. Oh, it was Ed Zwick.
Right. Yes.
And many African Americans were upset. But I remember this was the film about the African American Union soldiers that fought during the Civil War, and people said, "Well, this is being told from the perspective of the white soldier, It's not really being told from the perspective of the black soldiers.
It's
This is
always a risk.
Yeah, it's the same experience. And here, it's not really being told from the perspective, really, of the AIDS victim. It's being told from his lawyer, his crusading lawyer, who, very typical for a law film, needs to be redeemed himself.
Right.
It's a very typical, for those of you who've been with us for the last 3 years, you can see in the world of law films, the idea of the lawyer being redeemed is almost automatic.
We should also point out that this is far from the first movie to deal with AIDS, that there were, as early as 1985, TV movies about AIDS, and,
Right.
and independent movies like Parting Glances made from a really gay perspective, movies that did not attempt to translate gay for a straight audience. So we were 7 or 8 years into the possibility of movies and drama, including The Normal Heart, which I think was 1985, dealing with this. So I don't want to label it a groundbreaker of the kind that it wasn't.
But in terms of popular appeal,
yes,
said-
for
And
Hollywood
big
not
movies,
even-
Hollywood budget
terms of
with
big
stars
big
and all
star,
of
in
that.
terms
yes.
of more people seeing it, I mean, I hate to say this, I don't even think most people in the room who know who Larry Kramer is.
right? No, I mean, there's no question that this was a big.
Right.
TV had almost no gay characters. There was gay theater, but that was mainly New York. The movies were pretty small, or there were gay characters who were minor supporting characters. So yes, this was a step forward. I just wouldn't want to give the impression that
Right.
it was the first time people had gotten a look at.
Speaking of redeemed lawyers, tell us what, I've now seen it again several times, and it's a very interesting scene. The scene after that incredibly dramatic Oscar-winning moment when Tom Hanks is reciting Maria Callas's opera aria. We watch him, the camera watches him retell the story.
And he magically has the power to change the lighting in the room while
Yeah.
he does it.
That was cool.
Yeah.
At that point, Joe, his lawyer, has no further questions. We don't have to prepare for tomorrow. You're good. Why are you good? I don't know, but that opera scene was cool. He leaves. He wants to come back. He goes home. He hugs everybody he can imagine, and he has this look. Is that the epiphany? And tell us, what is that scene? Tell us what you think. What happens there? It's an interesting scene. What's going on? What has he learned that he didn't know before the opera?
I was thinking about that scene a moment ago when we were talking about the film being the story of the, in this case, the person from the sexual majority.
Right.
And I was thinking, that bizarre scene that had to be in there in order to win the Oscar,
Right.
I guess. That's why they wrote it or something. I don't know. Or to give him his gay bona fides or something.
Right. Opera queen.
Yeah.
You have to have the opera in him.
I think one of the blatant ideas of that scene is that there's a recognition of a real sinking in recognition of Andy's impending mortality. And the two men share that recognition together. And instead of the camera staying with Andy and our understanding anything about what he's really feeling about that, about what he and Miguel might be talking about,
Right.
or how they might be handling it, we go instead with
Hug the black kid.
with the guy who has
Hug
a
his
kid
wife.
and a wife, and we have that close-up on his face while he's lying still with his coat on in bed.
Seemingly
and
terrified.
terrified.
Although we also, between those two scenes, have that very interesting scene where he leaves, he hears the opera, he goes back, he almost knocks on the door,
Right.
and he doesn't. And when I saw that scene 15 years ago, I thought, oh, the purpose of this is to show that Andy has as rich and impassioned an inner life as anybody else does. This time, when I saw it, I really thought, oh, this is the moment that Denzel Washington realizes that he's going to die, that Andy's going to die, and that asking him to finish this questionnaire is pointless because he, Denzel Washington, will have to carry this case on his back on his own. And the going back, hugging the wife and kids, it's overdrawn. I was really quite fascinated by the scene where he almost goes back to the apartment and doesn't, because what you see in that moment is there are limits to the degree to which he can give himself to this guy as a friend, and he also realized that what is he going to do if he knocks on that door?
Capacity.
Like this, Andy may be beyond his help. Andy may not need his help in that way. What he needs him to go do is win this case.
So it's not, at that point, the homophobia is gone. It's now a question of capacity. It's not that, because
it's ambivalent.
It's an incredible scene.
Ambivalent.
He's incredibly uncomfortable, and he's completely sympathetic, and he comes back, and he just says, I'm going home.
Well, I think it's a very open moment. I mean, you can project all kinds of things onto what you think he might have wanted to say had he opened the door again. I mean, my impulse sounds like yours, that he wants to embrace him in some way. And I think in maybe I'm sort of reading backwards from the scene in the hospital when he puts the mask on him and touches his face, as the moment when it does knock on the door again. It kind of sets gives us more satisfaction in that moment, because he couldn't bring himself to do the equivalent kind of gesture earlier on.
I love the scene in the drugstore. Let me tell you why. It's a great scene, right? But I'll tell you what's interesting. Denzel Washington completely misreads what the Penn law student says when he says, this is a really important case. He thinks they're bonding first as lawyers. They're bonding as lawyers. It's an important legal case, and I'm a lawyer, and you're a lawyer, and I'm rooting for you, legally speaking, right? One level of solidarity. Second level of solidarity, brothers, black men. I'm a black law student at Penn, you're a black lawyer, cool, right? The one thing it never dawned on him is that there was yet another source of potential pride, that there is this connection in a sexual way. And yet, of course, we get yet, as Mark would say, another example of Denzel Washington telling us he's not gay.
With an armload of Pampers, let's not forget.
Right.
Yeah, I am not gay, and I'm going to punch you out if you insinuate it.
Right, but the very 1993 moment in that scene is that when Denzel Washington says, I'm going to punch you out if you insinuate it, the guy's like, come on, take me on.
Right.
That was
Bring
an
it.
absolutely capital P progressive gay moment for 1993. Because we've only had to look at physically weak Tom Hanks, we now get to see that, yes, gay men can have a fight and possibly win a fight.
Good.
And toss a football.
Right.
Right, good.
And be hot.
What about hot? Right. He was hot. We're going to take questions in a second, but one final thought, which goes back to our ongoing theme of law films. There is the seminal moment when the judge wants Denzel Washington to know that justice is blind. And then, in fact, in this courtroom, I must tell you, counselor, we don't see these distinctions. And there is this bizarre presumption that we keep accepting. In fact, we keep teaching law students. My students never hear that because we know it's total crap. But this presumption of innocence and presumption of impartiality and presumption of blindness and presumptions of objectivity and presumptions that we don't prejudge. And yet this whole movie is about prejudgment, right? And the attempts to conceal, because Tom Hanks knows that no good can come from having this information known. In fact, I didn't even like that scene in the sauna, because I would have said, Andy doesn't need to hear the raunchy joke for him to know. I think the filmmaker cheats there too. Is if Andy hadn't heard the joke, he might have shared the information.
Yeah, but the presumed audience hasn't heard the joke.
Right, no, but I'm saying, but that he could have said, are you kidding? This is a white shoe Philadelphia law firm. Oh, speaking of white shoe, don't you just love all law films do this, and it picks up on this idea. The defendants needed to be represented by a woman, and the second chair had to be African American. Right?
I'm surprised the judge wasn't African American
Right.
and a woman, because
Right.
that's like the Law and Order rule.
Exactly,
isn't it?
right. You couldn't
I sort
possibly.
of felt like this was the prototype for Law and Order.
A little bit. I mean, it's the thing that bothers me about the movie legally, and maybe someone can explain this, is I think like so many law movies, the pivotal moment is a fake out. because the take off your shirt and show us the lesions thing, it's this unbelievably dramatic and painful moment, and it makes the case that what? That results in a $4.7 million punitive verdict. It makes the case that they could see the lesions, and therefore they knew what the lesions were, which seems to have been something that was already addressed in earlier testimony. It's like, it's a moment that's very effective as drama. I don't really buy it as the playing out of a particular legal idea, but
Well, the attempt to do the aha moment was with this earlier senior partner about what happens when you were in the Navy. That was supposed.
Right.
That was it. It was early, and it's not the definitive. Aha, we got you. You're a homophobe, right?
Right.
So they try that once. They slip it by once, and then they try it again, where they say, "Are you a homosexual?" And then the senior partner says, "Are you kidding?" You know, he says, "That's the," and then it really comes down to, I think at least, and it's not, and I think Mark's quite right. It's at this point, it's not really a legal issue.
no, the way it plays is you look at him and you feel so bad for him
That's
because
right.
he's Tom Hanks and he's thin and he has KS and he's dying.
Yes.
That, you know, he gets the money.
Yes, and in fact, you
Yeah,
could
don't
argue
forget
that
the juror
justice
scene,
is not
right?
blind.
I'm sorry?
men.
But we're forgetting the scene where the brief moment when we see the jurors deliberating, and the one guy who snickered at the homophobic jokes,
Right,
and
right.
you know,
Right.
is the macho Air Force guy or
Right.
whatever he is, doesn't refer to any of that. It's all about
He talks about John McCain.
something
Right.
like that.
But I thought that scene, Mark, was an attempt to do another way of looking at justice is not blind. Because there is an example.
Because it's about seeing?
Yes.
I mean, literal seeing?
Yes, and the sense of as much as there's prejudice in the courtroom, right, that is unrelated to the legal issue, right, prejudice in the courtroom, there was also something that you point out correctly. What's the legal significance of that? Nothing. The legal significance of it, this is an incredibly sympathetic white man who's gay, who's dying tragically, and we've already seen him collapse. We've seen him in terrible strait, and here he is. This is the disease. Look at the disease. Don't you feel sorry for this man? Simply, let's do something for him. And I think it's another look at justice not being blind, that it's really about the way we perceive things regardless, right? As you said, it doesn't really prove anything legally. It just proves that now we get to really look at the disease. We see what the partners may have seen. It could have played out differently. You could have said, God, that is just so gross. You can kind of see why you wouldn't want a guy like that around, right? And instead they say...
With different staging or emphasis, yeah.
Exactly.
By the way, just one interesting little bit of trivia. The scene where Mary Steenburgen walks back to the counsel's
Yes.
table
I hate
and
this.
mutters, "I hate this case," was, I believe, put in at the insistence of Mary Steenburgen, who felt that she would never work again if she played this horrible a character without one redeeming moment. So, you know, actress self-exoneration can be as much of a shaping influence in a movie as, you know, writing or directing or producing.
Let's take some questions. Yes?
So I'm a professor in class, and as a law student, I found the movie extremely frustrating because of the legal inaccuracies and the way the trial was portrayed. The real issue. Okay, well, and how the real issue of whether Andy was a good attorney or not was never actually proved. And it makes me think of so many movies where big issues are sought to be decided in courtrooms, which are not actually the best places for them to be decided. This is something like we often discuss in the class, but I just wanted to get your thoughts on that and whether you think that was something that came up in the movie that bothered you at all.
That last point is what? The last thing you just said. Before you said what bothered you, the last thing.
Well, I think,
Sure,
that they never actually demonstrate
Right.
in the courtroom that Andy was a stellar attorney. I mean, I think that from the audience's point of view, that's a given from early on. You know, you're right, legalistically, that doesn't happen in the courtroom. But for for the film audience, it's established at the beginning of the film, and so I guess it would be plot-wise considered redundant to have to establish it in the court.
Well, but it's also presented in
but
the jury.
you're right, legally.
Yes, but in the jury room, it's based on implication, right? You don't hand your $350 million, jet to
Right.
someone who's not good at it. And so by implication, the biggest case in the office is going to this senior associate, and that is Exhibit A, that we have a guy who's a rare talent. But right, other than that, they cheat. That's the one thing they do. Yes?
Of whether this movie had anything behind it that we were missing. And I don't know if Professor Rosenbaum knows this, but right now the fundamental lawyering skills class is showing clips of this film as little more than how to be a zealous advocate for your client and how to gather information and how to sit there and do research. And my question is there any worry that even though maybe this movie isn't completely representative of what it should have been of, that its meaning is going to get completely lost in future generations, that all it's going to become is a movie of how to sit in the library and gather information and how to make sure that your client is portrayed a certain way?
Are you suggesting that at one point there will be a cure to the AIDS virus and that the only thing that will be left is not
No, I'm suggesting that the way that the movie is being taught to new generations
Oh, I
who
see.
didn't necessarily grow up in such an adverse environment towards AIDS, who are more tolerant of certain situations, will be completely lost. And is that
What do you
any
think about
fear?
that? That's an interesting question for the two of you.
Well,
The politics of it becomes neutered. It's not about the politics, it's about this sort of the trial strategy. It's really about showing a lawyer who will go to any length, even if he doesn't like his client, even if he disapproves of his sexual practices, but he's a crusading lawyer in the good spirit of law movies. They'll do anything for the cause.
Well, I kind of hope so. I mean, I hope we get to a point where homophobia and AIDS phobia are so irrelevant that this film doesn't touch people on those levels. It doesn't need to.
But I hope it will also be seen as a somewhat accurate snapshot of what certain of these issues were like at that moment. I think there's a lot more environmental stuff than I remembered in the movie. I mean, the scene very early on where Tom Hanks goes from his job to go get an IV drip, and you see it's not made a big deal of. You see him sitting in a treatment room with a number of other people, some of whom are obviously actors with AIDS. This was a very, very common thing, that treatment room. For a very specific period, it was unique to the AZT years.
Right.
And
that scene can only mean one thing.
right, and
Right.
and it's a scene that could only have landed in a movie made at this particular moment.
Right.
So I hope that people, there's always a danger that people take movies as too historically accurate, but there are historical accuracies in this movie that 15 years later already feel historical rather than
Right.
contemporary, and I'm sort of glad they're there.
Yes.
I was wondering whether anybody wondered whether there was any consideration given to having the jury deliberation include some discussion, however it would have been done, of the circumstantial evidence that they fired him because he was gay with AIDS. The only deliberation that you saw was about his
Right.
being a good lawyer, but they didn't process the circumstantial evidence.
It's a great question for Ron Nicewater, the screenwriter, to
Yeah.
know if there was
Well,
anything more ever there.
Actually, if you rent the DVD, you can see in the, what do you call those?
The extras.
Features? The extra features, some cut scenes, and it includes some more jury deliberation. It also includes a really bad scene of Andy and Miguel in bed together. That,
So you think it was cut because it was bad, or cut because it was Andy and Miguel, his boyfriend?
Well, Andy and Denzel Washington would be weird.
yeah, right.
Because that would be like Joe going really much further than we
I
expect.
mean, just having a conversation. I mean, not
Right.
a sex scene, but still. It's a really bad scene.
It's interesting. I was thinking a lot of outtakes in DVDs. Love Actually takes out those things too. What comes out are gay people in bed. That comes out. Yes?
One thing that's particularly poignant to me is why they would analyze the issue of homophobia in the context of the legal practice. And I guess my question is, how much do you think this movie is actually a commentary on the legal practice, a practice which is supposed to be about justice and equality? Meanwhile, you have all these images of stark stratification within the field. You have the solo practice who's scamming for money. You have the associate who is working his hard hours and foregoing his much-needed respite to move ahead and do his work. And then you have the boardroom filled with partners smoking up cigarettes, cigars, and just living the high life. So how much of a commentary do you think this is actually on the legal field, in addition to homophobia and AIDS?
Well, that was phenomenal, by the way. Look, Philadelphia in the world of law films, one of the things, it's funny, that's a very different perspective. In the world of law films, it's in the category of the evil law firm, like the Michael Claytons. You know, like we've seen, this movie's been recycled many times, right? The Firm, Philadelphia, Regarding Henry. You know, these are evil law firms, and this is another paradigm that viewers love to see about lawyers. It takes on, this is why this is such a tremendous question, the film really challenges two paradigms that we think about the law. One is the ambulance chaser, and the two is the heartless, soulless, mechanized, uncaring, unfeeling. They say to him in the same sentence, "You're our family, you're fired." Right? Same thing. We always use those words. "You're our family, we love you, get out. And I'm not going to touch your hand." And we have the guy in the very first hour, it's how often repeated, "Oh, you're on TV, the ticket guy." So you have the ambulance chaser and the evil law firm colliding, and that's what sort of makes this movie slightly different. And I think in some ways it overshadows what I would argue is the sexual politics in some ways. Like there is a way to see the film, which is why I thought your comment was so tremendous, because you could almost see it becoming that about that and losing the entire, what everyone said about it in 1993, it becoming, at that point, its historic level becomes diminished about these other tropes.
Except how, yes,
Right.
but you know, the
can't avoid-
intersection is in how thoroughly the sexual politics are expressed through the
Right.
practice of
Good
the
point.
evil law firm. That is a
Including the-
bunch of, you know, old white straight guys
Right.
who go to the club together, who sit in the sauna together, who, you know, presumably play golf and do all those things that guys do together, that
Right.
that won't permit a known homosexual, much less a woman, into those
And sure enough,
precincts.
Denzel Washington tells us repeatedly as the ambulance chaser, there's that really weird scene in the bar with all the other lawyers, male lawyers, right? They just hate gays. The bartender hates gays. They accuse him of, you know, liking gays. And so you have the image of the ambulance chaser, uncultivated. He doesn't know opera, right? All he knows is Julius Erving.
Although, you know, one thing I like about the movie, and that I didn't notice until I saw it this time, and I think that goes to your point, is that it's also, in its very small way, an argument against the politics of the closet, because the Andy you see in the first 15 minutes of the movie is not a saint. He is someone who is clearly gunning for partner in that firm, is willing to play ball and smoke cigars and go to the sauna with those guys. You know, when they call him in and say, "You just got this client," he's like outstanding. He knows their language. He knows how to speak it. He knows how to play ball. And he thinks that the gay part of his life is something that can be completely segmented off. He's not in the closet in his private life, but he is in the closet. Absolutely, despite what he says, "I never lied." He's in the closet at work. And so that character isn't just a saint to whom something bad happens. He actually, in his way, becomes politicized when he realizes that, you know, it is personal, that he's literally embodying something that other people hate, and that he can't hide it.
Yes, but I think isn't that first scene, the people who are lawyers and law students here, correct me if this is a misreading, but in that scene when he's offered the case, they ask him about it, and doesn't he take a very principled view of the case and possibly the one that he thinks his firm isn't going to share? And then he's kind of surprised that in fact he's hit the bingo. That's how I take it.
Yeah,
I think
I mean,
and that his secretary loves him and he's nice to everyone. And
I don't see him as like a contrarian firebrand going against the deep-rooted principles of his firm, though. I mean, he looks to me like someone who knows how to play the game according to the rules of the place he works. Yes, you are supposed to think in that scene he's on the side of the little guy rather than the evil, whatever they are, pollution dumpers or bad corporation. But you see him as the camera tracks through the hallway, and he talks to the paralegal and he talks to the secretary. This is a guy who is very much at home in that firm. He wants to be in the number one firm in the city. He wants to be the number one young guy at that number one firm.
There was something I didn't notice before until this time. Speaking about this high-powered Andy in the beginning, who plays the game as well as anybody, when he first goes to, when he's taken to the hospital, and he sees the commercial for the first time of the Denzel Washington character, he's mocking the guy who will eventually becomes. He doesn't respect. This is not and Denzel Washington's not a player. He's a small-time lawyer, and it's that's the paradox of the film. That's the guy he needs.
He's his 10th choice.
Right, he's his 10th choice, but that's the guy he sees him in the midst of, he's in the emergency room, and he's actually on the phone being told that the brief isn't in or whatever. That was the whole idea with the statute, limitations or deadline. And he takes time to mock him when he sees him on, and that's something I didn't notice. Any final questions? No?
there's one up there, it looks like.
Where are we?
In the back.
Somebody
In the
back there?
center.
Ah, yes, I'm sorry, I didn't see you. Yes.
Hi. I was just wondering if anyone saw what I believe I saw in that Maria Callas episode. I mean, it was just a look in Denzel Washington's eye. The whole first time, I mean, it's focused on Andy, but then when it's focused on Denzel, his brow is furrowed. Oh, I'm sorry. Thank you. His brow is furrowed, and he's clearly uncomfortable and not in his element. But at some point, I detected a switch, a definitive switch from a furrowed brow to not necessarily only a sympathetic brow, but almost a homoerotically, I almost thought he might even get up and hug him or want to kiss him, and that was a very interesting moment for me, which also led me to wonder why, when he left, he knocked back. He eventually decides to leave, but I didn't think that he was necessarily knocking back just to go help him. I almost thought that he was attracted to him based on real love and compassion. I wonder what you think of that.
Love it.
I mean, for me, I do think. I mean, I do think it's an extremely intimate scene, and you can read that in any number of ways.
Yeah, I mean, it's a perfect example of how movie content can be shaped through editing. I guarantee you they had 50 close-ups of 50 expressions that Denzel Washington had on his face to choose from, and they scripted that scene, and they scripted his progression in that scene by the close-ups that they picked. And I think it is what Alisa calls an open moment. It's a moment that, I mean, I don't take it as erotic. I think it's clearly a moment when he's struggling to connect to Andy and then connecting to him, but in what way and on what grounds and on what level is left to you to decide.
A few concluding remarks. First of all, tomorrow night is our final night of the Fordham Law Film Festival. We are finishing up tomorrow night at 7 o'clock here in McNally with Adam's Rib, and we'll be joined by Molly Haskell, longtime film critic, and Dan Kimmel, who's just written a book on romantic comedies entitled I'll Have What She's Having, which, as you know, comes from Harry Met Sally. We want to also remind you, if you're not registered for future events, we have our November 19th event at the Time Warner Center with Sam Waterston from Law & Order. You can always find our information on fordhamlawandculture.org and fordhamfilmfestival.org. We want to, of course, yes, no, I know that. This person who just reminded me, the person who runs everything, Helen Herman. Thank Helen Herman, the executive producer for the film festival and for the forum on law, culture, and society. And of course, Following this, there is a book signing outside for both of our friends and authors. And so I would like to very much thank Alisa Solomon and Mark Harris, and please join me in thanking them.